It was a frigid day in January, 1364, when the Rhine River in Germany froze so solid that the people of Cologne held an open-air market on top of the ice. Across Europe, chroniclers recorded other marvels of that brutal winter. Over in France, wine barrels burst from the cold, and down in Italy, snowdrifts piled so high that villagers had to shovel off their roofs to keep houses from collapsing. Stories like this of extreme winters, certainly capturing the imagination as we sit comfortably in our heated homes and comfortable chairs, very much safe and sound from the elements. But for our ancestors in medieval times, winter was an annual reality to be survived through grit and ingenuity. So the question is, how do you survive it? How did the people of the Middle Ages withstand long months of cold, darkness, and scarcity without any of the modern comforts? Let's talk about that today. We'll look at the whole medieval period in Europe and see how the peasants, townfolks, monks, and nobles alike coped with the challenges of winter, balancing those practical needs with a few cultural traditions, and we might even find some surprising ingenuity in the technology. Before we begin, allow me to welcome you to the channel. Hello to any newcomers. I invite you to subscribe if you've not done so, and I also invite you to boost us up in the algorithm. If you would take the time to leave a comment, click the like and hype buttons, always helps, is the best way to support the channel. And supporting the channel is important because, as you've noticed, we don't have any ads on any of our videos. This is because we are supported by the kind people on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who check out the merch store, and the donation links on YouTube and PayPal. All of the appropriate links can be found in the channel video and descriptions that you can find. Navigate to them if you feel inclined to do so. And now, without further ado, introductions and shameful e-begging out of the way, let us begin this challenge of the medieval winter. And when we think of a winter, we don't really get this uniform, one-size-fits-all kind of season. The climate shifted over centuries, and that affected how severe each winter could be. Let's look at the High Middle Ages, roughly 900 to 1300, when Europe experienced a period of relatively mild climate. It was often called the medieval warm period. A good time, especially for those with memories of colder winters. Historical records and scientific data suggest that average temperatures were slightly higher then, allowing longer growing seasons and fewer devastating winters. Grapes could even be grown in areas of England that are too cold for vineyards today. Yet even in this mild era, winter still brought cold and privation. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, conditions began to worsen. By the 1300s, Europe was sliding into a little ice age, a long era of cooler climate that would last into the 19th century. Now, this didn't mean that every winter was brutally cold. It doesn't really work like that. But it did bring frequent extreme weather and a general sense of unpredictability. Medieval people suddenly faced colder, longer winters with heavier snowfalls and extended freezes. Contemporary reports describe extraordinary events. The winter of 1363 to 64, for example, was so bitter that major rivers and lakes froze for months. We mentioned that near Mainz the Rhine stayed icebound for 70 days, and the people of Cologne had their little market. They could even walk atop the thick ice without really worrying about it. In normally temperate regions, unprecedented freezes occurred. The Venetian lagoon in Italy and the Atlantic coast near Bordeaux in France were crusted with ice that winter. Such conditions were shockingly abnormal for those southern locals, A Florentine chronicler in 1359 wrote of snow rising to extraordinary heights in central Italy, trapping people indoors for days. And even in the later centuries, during some winters, the city of Florence saw snow cover the ground for weeks, something almost unheard of in the modern day. Clearly, the medieval Europeans were no strangers to real cold. But for the average person, these harsh winters were not just mere curiosities. They were life-threatening events. Heavy snow and ice could destroy the year's food supply, or even cut off villages entirely. One chronicle from Montpellier in southern France tells of the terrible winter of 1389. Snow fell so persistently in the mountain region of Lozère that many isolated farmsteads collapsed under its weight. People were snowed in for weeks. According to the scribe, some villagers froze to death in their flimsy homes, and others starved after their provisions ran out due to the unusually long siege of snowy weather. As for the elderly folk, they claimed they hadn't seen such a winter in 80 years. This was the deadly side of the medieval winter, a force that could bring human activity to a standstill and push those communities to the brink of famine. But even in less extreme years, winter was still a season of great difficulty. Medieval culture associated winter with hardship, old age, and death for a very good reason. A 13th century English scholar, Bartholomaeus Anglicus, which is a really impressive name, I love that, wrote in his encyclopedia on the properties of things, quote, "Winter is cold and moist. By the hard cruelty of winter all things that flourished in summer fade and die." This somber view reflects how winter imposed a general slowing of life, no cause for celebration for anyone. The days were short, they were dark, the weather often made travel impossible, and the land yielded very little nourishment. Medieval poets captured the mood. A Middle English lyric from the 13th century laments, "Winter awakens all my sorrow, now that the leafy branches are bare. All this world's joy comes to nothing." Emotionally and physically, winter tested medieval people's endurance. Yet despite the gloom and danger, they survived, year after year. And to understand how they survived, we have to look at the preparations and clever adaptations they made. Of course, survival began long before the first snow fell, during the bountiful days of autumn. It reminds me of a saying that we have in Chinese, "Repair the roof before it rains." So what's the key to getting through? Yeah, we just gotta plan things in advance like anything else. Medieval communities worked pretty hard during the warmer seasons to store up enough food and fuel to last through the dead season, which is probably the most ominous name they could have called it. In an agricultural society, the cycle of the year centered on the harvest, and nowhere was this more crucial than in planning for winter. Each autumn, usually around late September and October, peasants toiled from dawn to dusk to bring in the crops, threshing grain and gathering all manner of food that could be preserved. Grain, especially wheat, rye, barley, and oats, was the staple of life. After harvesting the fields, people dried and stored the grain carefully in barns or granaries, knowing it would be the basis of their diet until the next summer. And safe storage, that was vital. Dampness, rodents, mold. It could spoil the supply. Archaeological studies of medieval barns show raised wooden platforms or suspended floors were often used to keep grain dry and away from mice. A successful grain harvest and proper storage meant bread and porridge throughout the winter. But a poor harvest, well, that would mean you're probably all going to starve to death. And no one likes that. So besides grains, Medieval people preserved as much food as possible in their gardens, and also from their herds and the wild too, whenever they could find it. Vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots were dug up and packed in cellars or pits laid with straw to keep them from freezing. Cabbages and hardy leeks might be left in the ground late into autumn, or even into the winter, and harvested as needed, since plants like that can tolerate the cold fairly well. Beans and peas were dried for storage. Fruits that could not be eaten fresh were often dried. Apples and pears might be cut into rings and hung from rafters, raisins made from grapes, and plums turned into prunes. In some cases, fruit was boiled with honey or sugar, for those who could afford such luxuries, which, well, it's a bit touch and go on that one. And they would make preserves or thick pastes that would last for months. Nuts gathered in the woods, like chestnuts, walnuts, hazelnuts. They were another source of winter calories, and they could be stored in their shells too. So it saves buying an extra container, I suppose. Now as for meat, well, meat was a special challenge. Without any refrigeration, fresh meat would spoil quickly. So medieval people developed a range of preservation methods. One widespread solution was salting. Each autumn, often in November, families culled their livestock and salted down the meat. Medieval farmers knew exactly how many animals they could afford to feed through winter. Fodder like hay and grain was limited. So rather than watch half of their herds starve in the cold months, they slaughtered the surplus in late fall. In England, the traditional time for this was around Martinmas, that is November 11th. Cattle, sheep, and pigs that could not be overwintered were butchered. The meat was then salted heavily to draw out moisture and prevent bacterial decay. Every manor house or peasant cottage had tubs of brine or dry salt, ready for curing cuts of pork and beef. They packed the meat in salt. Then they would let it sit for days or weeks, a process which preserved it pretty nicely, albeit at the cost of taste and texture. But hey, it tastes better than nothing, literally. Well, after salting, the meat might be hung in a cool, dry place or smoked over a smouldering fire to add further preservation. Smoking was the common form for pork. Sides of bacon, hams, and sausages made from the autumn slaughters would slowly cure in the smokehouse or chimneys, absorbing flavors and becoming stable enough to last most of the winter. Fish, too, was preserved by salting and drying. In coastal areas and river regions, autumn catches of herring or cod were packed in barrels of salt or dried hard as stockfish. This provided a protein source for winter, and it also met religious needs. The church imposed many fish days, including every Friday and the 40 days of Lent, when meat could not be eaten. So having a bit of preserved fish around was pretty important. Dairy products were another seasonal food that had to be managed. In spring and summer, cows and goats gave plenty of milk, but in winter the yield dropped, or even worse, it would just cease completely. So, to make the summer milk last, medieval households turned milk into cheese and butter. Cheese is essentially a way of preserving milk protein in a fermented, long-lasting form. It wasn't really invented out of concerns for taste or anything, but rather just practicality. Hard cheeses, made in the warmer months rather, could be aged and consumed throughout the winter, when fresh milk was scarce. Butter could be salted to help it last a bit longer in storage. Though in cold climates, butter could keep for a while just due to temperature. For many peasants, however, butter and cheese were luxuries. Much of the milk that came from their animals might have gone as feudal dues to the lord's estate, or to market for income. But still, even modest households might churn butter at summer's height, or use earthenware pots to store it in a cool spot for some weeks. By midwinter, fresh dairy was rare, which made any cheese or butter on the table quite a treat. And then we have grains, beans, salted meat, smoked fish, cheese, dried fruits, and nuts all gathered together, provisions to be carefully husbanded. A medieval family could hope to survive the cold months if they had a good mix of these. But survival often meant monotony. A peasant in winter largely ate from his own stores. Coarse, dark bread, maybe a bit of stale, thick pottage of grain and vegetables simmered together. And, well, if you were fortunate enough, a strip of salted bacon or some pulses for protein. Pottage was the staple dish, essentially whatever you had on hand boiled in a big cauldron. In winter it might include dried peas or beans, onions, some diced root vegetables like turnip or parsnip from the cellar, and maybe a chunk of that salted meat to flavor the broth. Well, the result was a nourishing, if bland, stew that could be reheated day after day. And everyone ate that, morning and evening, from a common pot. On particularly lucky days, there might be an egg or a bit of fresh meat, say a chicken slaughtered on a feast day, but more often than not, you wouldn't be so lucky. Well, anyway, to add variety, people used herbs like parsley, thyme, and garlic kept from the garden, and common spices such as mustard or pepper if available. Salt was crucial, both as preservative and seasoning, though good salt was expensive, since it had to be mined or evaporated from seawater and transported inland. Wealthier households had more exciting winter diets. Nobles and well-to-do town citizens could draw on wider resources. Their larders might hold game meat from hunting, venison, perhaps wild boar, fine wheaten bread, and imported spices to enliven the taste of preserved foods. Medieval medical theory, based on the four humours, taught that winter's cold and wet character increased the phlegmatic humour in the body, which needed balancing by hot foods. Doctors and health guides advised eating hot meats and strong wines in the cold season. A wealthy family's winter feast might include roast mutton or beef, meats considered warming, served with pepper, ginger, or cinnamon, costly spices imported from the East, of course, which, by theory and flavor, added heat to the body. They might drink a hearty red wine spiced with cloves. The butter and rich aged cheeses, raisins, figs, and nuts often graced the tables of those who could afford them during winter, both for calories and because they were seen as fortifying against the chill. Of course, these were luxuries of the privileged few. The common peasantry usually had to content themselves with simpler fare, if not meat, perhaps a little protein boost from black pudding, which is a kind of sausage made from blood, made after the autumn slaughter. Indeed, nothing was wasted. Pig's blood would be collected and mixed with oats and herbs to stuff intestines and make sausages that could be boiled or fried later. Not too glamorous, but it certainly provided what was needed. The iron, the fat in the diet. They didn't quite know about nutrition, but you certainly feel it when you haven't had a good meal, I can tell you that, especially when you just eat too much in succession. Recently I was on holiday and, good Lord, being away from my kitchen, I was glad to be back, and I certainly feel better for it now eating properly. In any case, probably too many pints as well. That was probably more the problem. Well, anyway, in harsh times, the very poorest might be reduced to foraging what little the winter landscape offered. Bark or moss boiled into dubious meals, or acorns ground into unappetizing flour. Famines occasionally struck when harvests failed, and contemporary accounts from the terrible Great Famine of 1315 to 17 describe people eating horses, cats, dogs, and, well, sometimes even each other. Once again, extreme cases. In a normal winter, careful planning and preservation ensured most communities could stretch their autumn bounty through until spring. even if it was just barely. The true test was making those stores last when March came, and the barrels and bins grew emptier by the day. Many a medieval family endured what was sometimes called the starving time in late winter and early spring, when reserves were almost exhausted, but the new crops had yet to grow. Thin faces and rumbling stomachs were common by the time Lent arrived. Survival all depended on rationing, and a little bit of hope that warm weather and a new growing season would come soon. But then again, storing food was one battle, but getting away from the bitter cold was another. Medieval people didn't enjoy the snug, well-insulated houses we have today. Anyway, most people lived in rough, small dwellings that were pretty difficult to heat. A typical peasant's house in medieval Europe was a simple timber or wattle and daub structure, often consisting of a single room or, at most, a couple of rooms. The walls might be made of wooden beams plastered with clay and straw, or of rough stones with quite a few gaps. The roof was usually thatched with reeds or straw. Such materials provided some shelter from the wind and rain, but they were far from airtight. Cold draughts found their way through the cracks in the walls and under ill-fitting doors. There was no such thing as double glazing, and indeed windows were a major weakness in keeping some houses warm. Many a peasant house only had a small window opening or none at all, and if windows did exist, they had no glass, which was a luxury product in medieval times. Instead, people might cover the opening with a wooden shutter, a piece of oiled cloth or parchment, or even just some thick paper. These coverings cut some wind, but not all. According to one account from 13th century France, the clerics of Maguelone would seal their chapel windows with plaster or mortar in winter to block any icy draughts. It helped a bit, but it left the interior dark. In wealthy settings like royal palaces or churches, you start to see a few glass windows by the High Middle Ages. King Henry III of England had parts of Westminster Palace glazed in the 1230s, so that the chamber may not be so windy as it used to be. His words. Well, even then, the glass was thin, uneven, and held in lead lattices which stopped the breeze but didn't really insulate against the cold. Thus, whether in a peasant hut or a baron's castle, winter cold seeped through indoors relentlessly. Heating was accomplished in the most basic way, lighting a fire. Every home, no matter how humble, needed a hearth to cook food and provide warmth. In modest cottages, the hearth was often just a fire pit in the center of the main room, or sometimes a raised platform of clay or stone on which a fire could be lit. There was, of course, no chimney. They would come much later. The smoke from the fire simply rose and found its way through a hole in the roof or through the thatch. Well, they might have had a hatch as well, who knows? Often it just filtered through the porous thatching material itself, and this meant that the interior of the house was usually smoky with a blackened roof. Visitors noted that peasant dwellings were black with smoke inside consistently, but that smoke had a side benefit. It helped cure meats hanging from the rafters, and it even kept insects at bay, albeit while irritating the lungs of the inhabitants. But still, smoke meant people's eyes watered and their throats got scratchy, a price they paid for warmth and cooking. In later medieval centuries, some houses, especially in towns or wealthier rural homes, began to incorporate chimneys or smoke funnels to improve ventilation. A funnel or hood might be suspended over the fire to guide smoke upward, perhaps venting into a crude chimney, or just out a hole. An early makeshift chimney might be made by sticking a wooden barrel or a clay pipe through the roof, giving smoke a more direct path out. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Brick or stone chimneys became more common in rich homes, allowing fireplaces to be built against walls rather than central fire pits. This development gradually made interiors less smoky and slightly more efficient at heating, since a fireplace could draw air better and you could close the room off more. You know. However, among the peasantry, open hearths without true chimneys persisted well into the late Middle Ages, and beyond in many regions. Whatever the design, fire was the heart of the home in winter. Families clustered round it for light, warmth, and cooking. Yet a single hearth fire had limited reach. In a large draughty hall, say the great hall of a castle or manor perhaps, a central hearth might take the edge off the chill immediately nearby, but the corners of the room remained cold. Castles present an interesting paradox, you see. They were built of stone for fortification, but stone walls turned frigid in winter. Without modern heating, a stone castle could be like an ice box. You're basically living in an igloo, the interior temperature only marginally above the outside. Lords combated this by maintaining multiple fireplaces in different chambers, and by using tapestries and hangings. A rich medieval hall would have heavy woven tapestries or cloth hangings on the walls, and these were not just for decorations, but they served as insulation and wind blockers against drafts coming through the masonry. Floors might be strewn with rushes, straw, or even layered carpets in late medieval times, if the owner could afford that, to keep one's feet off the cold stone. In ordinary homes, floors were usually just packed earth, but people spread straw or reeds on them, which provided some insulation and could be refreshed periodically, the old damp straw thrown out, new dry stuff laid down. Well, firewood was the primary fuel, and ensuring a sufficient supply was a constant concern. A household needed a lot of wood to keep a fire going through the winter months. During the autumn, peasants would collect and stack firewood, either from their own woodland if they had rights to one, or from common land where they could gather fallen branches. In many parts of Europe, laws allowed the poor to gather dead wood from a lord's forest for fuel, a right known as estovers in England. They could not usually cut down living trees without a penalty, but scavenging sticks and branches was permitted, or at least tolerated. As for the wood itself, it had to be kept dry. Usually it would be piled under some shelter or the eaves of a house. Hardwoods like oak or beech gave good, long-burning coals, whereas softwoods like pine burned quickly and were less desirable, though people pretty much used whatever they could get, really. Beggars can't be choosers. In regions without abundant forests, for example, parts of treeless moorland in Scotland or marshy areas in the Low Countries, people turned to alternative fuels such as peat. Now, if you've not heard of peat, it's basically a dense soil-like accumulation of decayed vegetation found in bogs. Cut into blocks and dried, it burns quite slowly and was an important fuel in medieval Ireland, Scotland, and Flanders, among other places. It has a distinct smoky aroma. It doesn't burn as hot as wood, but it was better than nothing when timber was scarce. For those who could afford it, charcoal was another fuel used especially in urban environments. Charcoal is made by slow-burning wood in low oxygen to create nearly pure carbon fuel. It burns hotter and with less smoke than raw wood, which made it useful for certain indoor fires and for industries like smithing. In late medieval London, for instance, there was a brisk trade in sea coal and charcoal, because surrounding forests had been over-harvested, and people needed fuel brought from elsewhere. By the 14th century, some London homes even used coal braziers, though coal fires were foul-smelling and not common in rural villages. Inside the home, families found small ways to maximize warmth. The architecture of peasant houses sometimes helped. One common design in northern Europe was the house-barn combination, where under the same roof you had a living space on one end and a byre or stable for animals on the other. Cows, sheep, or goats would be kept in the stable area overnight during winter. The body heat from a few cattle might slightly raise the temperature in the adjacent living room, or at least their presence protected the animals from freezing outside. It also meant sharing your house with the smells and sounds of livestock. But, for medieval people, they were pretty much used to that. It wasn't a big problem. In some alpine regions and Scandinavian farms, people literally lived above the barn, a second-story dwelling over the ground floor animal stall, effectively insulating themselves with an animal-heated basement. Every bit of warmth counted. So within the large living space, people made use of portable braziers on the coldest days. A brazier is a metal basin or box to hold hot coals. Medieval scholars mention that some homes kept a brazier of glowing embers to supplement the central fire. For example, a family might move a brazier to a corner under a table to warm their legs. These were handy, but they were also dangerous. One careless bump, and a house of timber and straw could catch on fire. Indeed, records show many accidental house fires started from braziers or tipped-over hearth embers. In those tight quarters, a brazier mishap could burn down whole rows of houses, and it often did. So, to stay warm at night, medieval people enjoyed a few clever tricks. One was the use of bed warmers and heated stones. Before retiring to sleep, they would heat a brick or stone in the fireplace. Once it was good and hot, they wrapped it in cloth or put it in a wooden box and slipped it into the bedding to pre-warm the bed. The residual heat would take the chill off the cold sheets, essentially a medieval hot water bottle. Water bottles filled with hot liquid were also used at times, by the way. Well, by the 16th and 17th century, the classic metal warming pans with long handles filled with coals became common. But in the medieval period, the simpler methods of hot stones was pretty typical. People also slept in nightclothes and caps to conserve body heat. We often see paintings of old-time sleepers with a long nightcap on, and this was entirely practical, as a great deal of heat escapes from one's head. If you don't know, well, it does. A medieval person might wear a linen cap or coif to bed, and possibly even gloves and socks if it was extremely cold. Piling on blankets, too, if you had them, was the obvious solution. They were usually woolen, sometimes layered with furs if available. The wealthy might have beds draped with thick bed curtains. Well, in a lord's manor or a merchant's townhouse, the large bed often had a canopy or curtains that could be drawn around the sides. When closed, these heavy cloth curtains trapped a pocket of warmer air for the sleepers' bodies, and any bed warmer used a small oasis of heat in a otherwise chilly chamber. Well, this is one region that such four-poster beds became popular in the later medieval centuries among those who could afford them. You still see them in a few houses around. They're more of an oddity these days, because they're more like a practical concern at the time. But these days we don't really have those concerns anymore. In any case, even with all of these measures, indoor temperatures in winter were low by modern standards. A peasant hut with a single hearth might only be a few degrees above freezing in the corners. People essentially acclimated to the cold. Historical evidence suggests that medieval folk simply tolerated the temperatures and bundled clothing even indoors. But the fire was life-saving and kept them from hypothermia. But it was not a tropical paradise, we can say that much. Accordingly, much of the effort to stay warm focused on clothing, wearing the right garments at all times. And there was that old saying too: there's no bad weather, just bad clothes. Well, clothing was in fact the primary defense against winter weather, since homes and fires could only really do so much. The basic principle was the same as now, basically. Well, layers of insulating material, preferably wool at the time, to trap body heat. And virtually everyone, from peasant to prince, relied on woolen clothing in winter. Wool was, well, it was kind of like the medieval wonder fabric. Warm even when damp, durable, and most importantly, it was abundant. Sheep were raised throughout Europe, and after shearing and spinning, their wool was woven into garments of varying quality. For winter wear, thick woolen cloth was ideal. A typical working man in medieval Europe would wear a long-sleeved tunic as his main garment. In winter, this tunic would be made of heavier wool and often worn in multiple layers. Perhaps an under tunic or shirt, and then an outer tunic or surcoat. Over the tunic, men might add a cloak or mantle, essentially a large piece of woolen fabric, often semicircular, that draped over the shoulders and could be fastened at the chest. Cloaks were the medieval equivalent of an overcoat. They could be pulled around the body for warmth, and even used as a blanket. Many cloaks featured hoods, or men wore separate hoods that covered the head, neck, and shoulders. The hooded cloak was ubiquitous in the cold weather. It shielded you from rain and snow, and the hood portion helped hold in heat from one's head. As we said, you lose quite a lot of body heat through the head. I don't know why, but you just do. Well, women's clothing was similarly involved in layers. A peasant woman in winter might wear a long linen smock or shift next to the skin as a kind of undergarment, with one or more long-sleeve woolen gown over it. She could wrap herself in a wool shawl or mantle and cover her head with a veil, cap, or hood. Both men and women often wore some form of leggings to cover the legs. Early medieval hose were like long stocks that might reach the thigh, held up by garters or a belt. By the High Middle Ages, men's hose often meant a tailored crotch, that is, the ancestor of joined tights, covering the legs fully. While peasants who could not afford tailored hose might simply wind strips of cloth or wear rudimentary leg wraps for warmth. Footwear in winter was also crucial. Leather shoes or boots were common, but these were not insulated. People sometimes stuffed their shoes with straw or wool for extra warmth. Thick wool socks could be worn if one had them. In extreme cold, fur-lined boots or wooden clogs could keep feet off the frozen ground, and we have accounts of medieval people wrapping rags around their feet inside shoes, an attempt to create a bit of cozy stuffing and insulation in between. And here's an interesting aspect of the medieval winter clothing, and that's the pretty much universal use of fur. You see, fur provides excellent insulation, and medieval Europeans certainly took advantage of it when they could. However, the problem is fur is pretty expensive, and also subject to social class restrictions through sumptuary laws. The richest nobles decked themselves in the most luxuriant furs: sable, ermine, and vair. Vair is a squirrel, by the way. They were considered to be prestigious linings for garments. Kings and queens donned cloaks trimmed with ermine tails, the famous white fur with the black tips. But for the common folk, these high-end furs were just out of reach. But there were humbler pelts available. Hare, that being rabbit, and lambskin, were two of the most commonly used furs among peasants and townfolk of modest means. After autumn hunts, a peasant might keep rabbit skins from any legal catch. Village tanners could also treat the hides, and women might sew together bits of fur to line a collar, or make a simple fur vest to wear under a coat. Even cats and foxes provided pelts that could be used into making warm linings or mittens. By the 14th century, rulers felt the need to regulate who wore what. Fashions in fur became kind of status symbols. In England, the sumptuary law of 1363 explicitly decreed that only a person of certain rank could wear particular furs. For example, the law allowed the wives and daughters of laborers and craftsmen to use rabbit, lamb, fox, or cat fur, but nothing more sumptuous than that. Now this tells us two things. First, that even non-nobles were indeed wearing those cheaper furs to keep warm, but second, fur was seen as such a marker of status that the elite wanted to reserve the finest types for themselves. In practice, a peasant simply used whatever he could get, legal or not, to survive the cold. Well, an old sheepskin coat, or a patched-together quilt of rabbit pelts, could be a lifesaver. Contemporary observations suggest that despite regulations, rural people sometimes did line their winter clothing with bits of fur from locally trapped animals. You just hope you don't get caught. And if you do, well, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, don't you? Now, as for gloves, they were widely worn in winter as well. Wool mittens with a single compartment for fingers and one for the thumb were easier to make, and they were pretty warm too. Wealthier individuals might have had leather gloves lined with fur or wool. Commoners often relied on mittens, which could even be made at home by knitting or stitching together cloth. Keeping the hands warm while working outdoors was essential. A farmer chopping wood or a housewife fetching water would certainly prefer not to have bare fingers in freezing temperatures. And then there were the head coverings. Aside from hoods attached to cloaks, people wore a variety of caps. The simplest was a coif, a small linen cap tied under the chin, often used as an underhood or by itself indoors. Outdoors, men might wear felted wool hats or knitted caps if available. Even broad-brimmed hats like a pilgrim's hat could be lined or pulled low to keep their head warm. Women generally covered their heads with linen veils or handkerchiefs as a norm, and in winter they could layer additional wraps or woolen veils for warmth. Indoors, people often kept their winter clothes on, unlike modern times where we shed coats and hats in a heated home. A medieval family's cottage was only marginally warmer than outside. It was common to remain bundled up even at the fireside. Accounts mentioned people wearing their outdoor cloaks inside and sleeping in some form of their garments for warmth. Only when retiring under their blankets at night would they remove some layers. And, as I did mention, they would don a nightcap, or a kind of wrap, to bed. As for bathing, that was pretty infrequent in winter, and indeed infrequent in general for many, so they didn't have the luxury of changing outfits often. Another incentive to just keep layering over what they already had on. Of course, all these clothing strategies allowed medieval people to maintain a decent body temperature while working or just resisting the cold conditions. But many would have experienced chronic chill and discomfort anyway. In literature, there are references to shivering and numb extremities as common winter experiences. One example comes from William Langland's late 14th century poem Piers Plowman. In describing a poor ploughman and his wife in the winter, Langland gives a visceral image. The man's cloak is so thin and full of holes that his hair sticks out through the gaps, and his toes protrude from boots worn ragged. His wife trudges beside him, her legs bare to the knee and her feet bleeding from the icy field, with only a torn piece of cloth, a winnowing sheet, wrapped around her to keep her out of the cold. It might be a little exaggerated, but it certainly paints a picture of the hardships of the rural poor. Despite all their preparedness, the poorest of medieval folk did suffer bitterly, no matter what. Just some suffered less than others. But between all the trying not to die activities, what did people actually do all winter? You can't just sit in your house rubbing your hands together, can't you? But with the fields frozen and daylight scarce, you might assume that life completely shut down until spring, and yeah, fair enough, winter was a slower season, especially for agricultural laborers. But there was still plenty of work to be done, and a daily rhythm to maintain. Medieval peasants did not have the luxury of complete hibernation. Animals needed tending, equipment needed fixing, and certain tasks were actually best done in winter's lull. Dawn would come late. How late? Well, it depends where you are. But in midwinter it might be not until 8 a.m. or later until higher latitudes. But by first light, whenever it comes, people were up and starting their chores. In the countryside, a farmer's first duty on a cold morning was often to check on the livestock. The cows, the oxen, the sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, all domesticated animals required care throughout the winter, which actually made this time of year labor-intensive in its own way. Cows and oxen had to be fed from the store of hay gathered in summer. Fresh grass was unavailable under snow or frost, so the hay pile steadily diminished as the beasts munched their way through it, slowly but surely. Nom 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 nom. Sorry about that. Anyway, well, water had to be provided too, sometimes breaking the ice on a bucket or a stream so the animals could drink. Stables needed mucking out to keep them sanitary and dry, at least by the standards of the day. The accumulated manure was set aside, later to be used as fertilizer in the fields. Sheep and goats, if kept in pens or fold yards, also needed fodder, dried grass, leaves, turnips, and also protection from predators and cold. As for the pigs, they might have been butchered or in large part by winter, but any breeding sows kept for spring litters would be given kitchen scraps or grain to survive, and they were happy to get it. Well, for medieval farmers, these daily rounds of feeding and watering were non-negotiable. You see, a cow could die in a single frigid night if not sheltered or given enough food. Thus, even if a blizzard raged, someone had to trudge out to the barn to tend the creatures. Once the animals were seen to, people turned to other tasks. If there was snow to clear or ice to break for accessing the well or stream, that would come next. In many villages, the communal water source was a well or spring, and in deep winter wells could freeze, so villagers might have to work together to thaw a hole or carry ice inside to melt. As for the firewood, that might need to be brought in each morning, a chore often assigned to an able-bodied youth of a household. It's not too difficult. They would fetch logs from the woodpile and stack them by the hearth to keep the day's fire going. And as the winter sun rose higher, if it wasn't obscured by the heavy clouds, people busied themselves with indoor and maintenance work. Medieval peasants took advantage of winter's relative pause in field work to repair their tools and homes. The family might spend time mending the thatch on the roof, a precarious job on a frosty morning, but pretty necessary to fix leaks. Tightening loose wooden shutters or daubing more mud clay into wall cracks, they were the main jobs. And actually, the cold weather actually made the ground firmer for heavy work like carting manure. Frozen earth was easier for wagons to roll over than muddy autumn soil, so winter was prime time for spreading manure on fallow fields as fertilizer. When conditions allowed, that is. Accounts from manors indicate that January or February, when not actively snowing, could be used to haul manure out to the fields and dump it in preparation for the spring plough. Similarly, winter was tree-felling season. If new timbers or wood for construction were needed, peasants and foresters often cut trees in mid to late winter, when the sap was low and the wood lighter to transport. Hauling timber on sledges over snow was sometimes easier than over rutted summer roads. Inside the home, handicrafts and domestic industries kept people busy enough. For women especially, winter was spinning and weaving time. Throughout the agricultural season, women were occupied with field work, gardening, food processing, and child rearing. In winter, some of these tasks eased, allowing more focus on textile work, a crucial part of household economies. Spinning raw wool or flax into thread was a never-ending chore, hence the word spinster for an unmarried woman perpetually at the spinning wheel or distaff. By the fireside, women and girls would spend hours each day in winter spinning yarn, which could later be woven into cloth. Weaving itself might be done on a household loom if one had it, or people might take their spun yarn to a local weaver in the village. In some regions, entire cottage industries of weaving and knitting thrived in winter. For example, in the later Middle Ages, knit wool caps and stockings became popular exports. Many were knit by peasants in their homes during winter. Inside the downtime, they could earn a bit of extra money by doing that. In colder parts of Scandinavia, wood carving and iron working by peasants in winter produced goods that could be traded when spring came. A farmer might carve spoons, bowls, or even parts for a plough when stuck indoors during a blizzard. As for the men, they would also repair and make tools and equipment. This was the time to resharpen the ploughshare, mend the broken wagon wheels, twist new rope, and carve new handles for axes and shovels. Blacksmiths, if they were present, were kept busy in winter fixing metal implements brought in by farmers, who suddenly had time to attend to such repairs. Likewise, any communal projects like mending the village fence, clearing out an irrigation ditch, or fixing the church roof might be scheduled for the winter months when labor could be spared from the fields. And speaking of the fields, though they lay fallow or dormant, some agricultural tasks did occur in the winter. It was just a little different. In much of Europe, winter crops like wheat and rye were sown in the late fall, that is October or November in the northern hemisphere, and then essentially left in the ground over winter. The seeds would germinate, and the young shoots of grain would go semi-dormant during the cold, ready to burst into growth when the spring warmed the soil. These winter crops needed very little attention until the spring came, of course. But farmers, of course, were quite anxious about them. A lot riding on that crop, that's for sure. A poor winter, too wet, too icy, or with extreme temperature swings, could kill off the fragile shoots. Snow was paradoxically welcome as insulation for winter grains, whereas bare frozen ground could be harmful. On days when fields were accessible, peasants might walk out to inspect the wheat fields, praying that they would survive. Other field work that took place in late winter included pruning and planting in vineyards and orchards. Vineyards were an important part of agriculture in France, Germany, Italy, and other regions. Vines were typically pruned in January or February, when the plants were dormant, to prepare the next season's growth. This pruning could be arduous in cold weather, but it was necessary for a good grape yield. Similarly, fruit trees might be pruned in winter, and new trees or vines planted while the ground was soft enough to dig, sometimes in February in milder climates. Medieval calendars often depict February with images of people trimming grapevines or hacking at leafless trees, a true reflection of the work done at that time. But winter also meant taking stock of supplies and making them last. In a farmhouse, each week someone would check the granary to see how much wheat and barley remained, decide how much could be ground into flour, and how much must be saved for later months. The lady of the house, whether a peasant wife or a manor's mistress, had to manage the pantry carefully. Salted meat might be doled out sparingly to make it last till spring, barrels of ale monitored so they didn't all get drunk by midwinter, and seeds for the spring planting carefully guarded from the hungry mouths. Rodents, of course, were the constant menace, as they too wanted to have something to eat. Thus, winter had its share of trapping mice in the granary and guarding the grain bins. A common medieval sermon example imagines a housewife frustrated by a cat getting into the stored meat and the dog into the milk, and indeed keeping one's precious stores safe from animals and sometimes neighbors was a continuous worry. But despite the cold, travel and trade did not cease entirely in winter. It slowed significantly, yes, but certain activities picked up. For example, winter was actually a season for selling preserved goods. Salted fish and meat, cheese, and grains that were put up earlier might be taken off to market if a family had surplus. Many regions held winter fairs or market days after the harvest and around midwinter, often timed with religious festivals where people exchanged goods with each other. Traveling in winter could be treacherous too. Roads turned to mud or were blocked by snow, and daylight was short, so only essential journeys were made. Pilgrimages and military campaigns were usually avoided in midwinter, though there were exceptions. As for the messengers, they still rode, and some merchants still plied routes when possible, especially in areas with passable roads built by the Romans, or frozen rivers that paradoxically made decent highways. In fact, a frozen river could become a smoother road than a boggy land route in certain cases, enabling sledges and carts to travel where they couldn't in the rainy seasons. For common folk, winter travel might mean simply going to the nearest town to pay rent or attend church festivals like Christmas or Candlemas as early February. Neighbors visited one another more locally, perhaps gathering in one house, maybe the village tavern, to share warmth and company when work allowed a break. Being outdoors for long was unpleasant. So much of daily life in winter took place in cramped but comparatively warm indoor spaces. Families spent more time in close quarters, which could lead to frayed tempers but also fostered storytelling, music, and bonding around the hearth. Well, in the evenings, with darkness stretching from late afternoon to morning, medieval people adjusted their routines. Without electric lighting, nighttime activity was pretty limited. Well, I suppose that depends on the activity. We won't say more about that. Well, candles and oil lamps were expensive to burn for long hours, so many households simply went to bed early. They might rise in the night for a while and then return to sleep, a pattern called biphasic or segmented sleep, which some historical evidence supports as a common thing in pre-modern times. Those who could afford candles or had a good fire might spend the early night hours in conversation, telling stories, singing songs to stave off the eerie quiet of a winter night. Winter, after all, its prime storytelling season in many cultures. A time to pass the long evenings with folktales and legends, the glow of the hearth, the occasional crackle of logs, the backdrop to a very intimate gathering. So in the end, how did they get through? Well, the answer lies in preparation, practical knowledge, communal effort, and, of course, a sheer toughness handed down through generations. Certainly wasn't easy. Many winters brought suffering, occasionally tragedy for those who were vulnerable, the very young, the very old, the very poor. Yet by and large communities came through the cold each year by relying on what we might call a culture of resilience. Well, I think we should always recognize the adaptability of medieval people. Over the course of a millennium between 500 and 1500 CE, they experienced significant climate fluctuations. During the milder centuries, they expanded agriculture to new heights, draining fens, colonizing northern lands, only to be challenged by that colder era that followed. They responded with innovation, better crop rotation to maximize yields, ensuring more surplus for winter, improved hearths and chimneys for safer heating, new crops like the turnip, introduced in later medieval or early modern times, which could serve as winter fodder, and the aforementioned tile stoves in Germanic areas were improved quite a lot for heating efficiency indoors. And by the late Middle Ages, some urban homes in Central Europe had masonry tile stoves that could radiate heat long after the fire was out. A technology borrowed from the Swiss and Germans, very useful in the high alpine winters. So ultimately, it was practical measures mixed with mental fortitude. Winter was an inevitability, and they braced themselves each year. So, well, I guess if they didn't survive it all, well, we wouldn't be talking about it. So many times the human race could have gone completely extinct, but guess what? We are still here. So, count your blessings, I suppose. And for all of the problems that our modern world has, at least we have insulation. At least we have heaters. When that winter comes, we kind of romanticize it these days. Oh, well, we can have movie nights at home and order in pizza and sit there and watch horror movies under the blankets together, and it's really comfortable and nice. Well, there wasn't much of that going on 500 years ago. Anxiety and fear. For me, winter's my favorite season. There's always been something very romantic about it. Something, I don't know, I went traveling extensively for a 3-month trip in winter, and felt like I had the whole world to myself. Kind of weird loneliness too, I guess, but like the atmosphere, I don't know, there's something special about it. Anyway, it's all a bit euphoric, I won't go on about it. I would like to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters, though, staving off the winter of this channel. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron. Oh, sorry, Susan. Susan likes it when I say her name a bit longer like that, so I'll do my best to keep saying it. Carrie, Charlene, Linderie, Scatiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari. Excuse me. There we go. Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie, B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalypstic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Pretty, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, and Alexa. Okay, that's all we have for today. Unless you want to go watch another video, which you're welcome to. Do whatever you like. It's all up to you. But that's enough for me. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you next time. Farewell for now.